Okay, so let's give it a go. Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to the first cover seminar for this year. For this week, we're joined by Adam Jones from Asset Horizon. I'll just do a sort of a brief introduction and framing, and then we'll sort of go from there. So the idea for this session is I think I first heard Asset Horizon maybe about a year or two ago. I can't remember exactly. Time is very strange since COVID. I lose track of when's what, but about a year or two ago. And I really liked it as a podcast series for doing really interesting work in exploring, Deleuze, Guattari, post-structuralism, psychoanalysis, spirituality, a few occult themes, a lot of really interesting stuff. And what I really liked about it is this method, using a podcast where you're doing philosophy, doing philosophical work, but not in a closed seminar room, but in a more open format where people come into and are engaged in with thinking together in different ways, and thinking that sort of opens up the kinds of possibilities you have for discussions, education, and thinking in a way that is quite interesting. And it reminded me a lot of things like the early semitext sort of works where you sort of have sort of an overlap of punk, Deleuze, and Aphorismo, or sort of let's say 15 years ago, the sort of early Zero books where you sort of have philosophy happening in blog space. So thinking about moving into different media formats, different spaces, which can then be used for thinking together, reading groups, discussions, all sorts of things. I thought, oh, well, this is super interesting. One of our ideas in cover is to think about creating commons, but also at the level of education and how we think together. So I was like, why don't we just invite along some folks from Asset Horizon, and you can tell us about what you do and how it works, and we can have a chat about that. So that was my thought process. And so this is Adam Jones, who, I'll hand it over to you, and you can tell us some stuff. Is that cool?
Well, yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks for that introduction. So the project, yes, was very much a creature of the pandemic. It was actually an outgrowth of a sort of a wider sort of grouping together of people interested in philosophy and critical theory, particularly the work of Deleuze and Guattari. There was this essentially a Discord server called Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective, which is still got like hundreds of people going on, which was a selection of reading groups where people would go, okay, we've got this. People fortunate enough to have the time during the lockdowns off would go, okay, what's this one book I wanted to go for ages? And a lot of them chose Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oculus. And the podcast originally started off as an outgrowth of that, and I joined about 5-6 episodes in. Because they wanted to somewhat diversify by bringing someone who's a Hegelian on rather than a standard Deleuzian. But now I'm a long recovering Hegelian. But in terms of the ideas of, I wouldn't say Asset Horizon is so much a podcast, so much as it is a collective, because we do try to branch out beyond the medium purely of audio. So I guess in terms of any sort of project we could describe it as, it's primarily a bunch of disillusioned academics and disillusioned teachers and disillusioned students who are working together to try and take things out of the academy insofar as the academy is becoming increasingly impossible to pursue interests under. Insofar as creating a commons, I wouldn't say that our aim is to create some sort of model of a commons, of intellectual commons. I think insofar as what we try to do is create libraries of discussions, because every episode format is roughly the same on the main Asset Horizon series, which is we'll take a short text, provide a link to it, and then we'll read it, then try to recount these texts, critique these texts, and it's kind of halfway between a reading group and a explanatory video essay, in the sense it maintains that sort of conversational format. But overall, the aim of this and the multiple different formats we do for these shows is to not so much provide a commons in the sense of because it's not fundamentally a commons insofar as we're still behind the screen as recorded discussions, but to provide something in a sense of a conceptual toolbox, which is something which can be part of an intellectual commons. kind of like the conceptual equivalent of a tool library, where rather than having privately concepts locked behind in a shed or locked behind in a store where you have to buy them, essentially we just put them out there and they are free. I mean, the original, one of the standard ways of doing podcasting, for example, is to have a one-on, one-off model where you would, one free episode a week, one bonus episode a week. You pay to get the bonuses. That's not something we really want to do, because that's just fundamentally saying, it's placing a sort of value model on different styles of interview. Two, it creates unnecessary barriers. I mean, occasionally we often, one of the things that does keep the lights on for us is reading groups. We run reading group sessions. We've run one for about over a year straight on Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus. We also do one-off ones. So once I did one on Stirner. Will, one of our other colleagues, did one on Foucault, and we're currently also running one on George Bataille, and one for Zero Books on Mark Fisher's cybernetics and flatline in his doctoral thesis, Flatline Constructs. And these are essentially free if you ask for them. If anyone wants them, we'll just hand them out. But in terms of the project itself, I mean, it is a project of creating a conceptual library of tools, because fundamentally it is harder and harder to observe these things in a regular institution. I mean, we might as well go for the Moten and Harney quote, which I've noted down here, which is, it cannot be denied that the university is a place of refuge, and it cannot be accepted that the university is a place of enlightenment. In the face of these conditions, one can only sneak into the university and steal what one can. To abuse its hospitality, despite its mission, to join its refugee colony, its gypsy encampment, to be in but not of. This is the path of the subversive intellectual in a modern university. And I think it is important to see the university solely in terms of its capacity for refuge and what it can give you. I mean, some sort of academic virtues in and of themselves may not be even of themselves valuable. For example, they can conflict with this hospitality, which makes refuge possible. And we can see this very much in the case of the so-called academic freedom of someone like Kathleen Stock, which is actually averse to the hospitality of marginalized groups, particularly trans and non-binary people within the university itself. So it's really trying to decouple or subtract, not only in the sense of use of university resources, but subtracting the kind of model of intellectual that one is trying to be produced in the university. And we try to explore that as well in many of the topics that we want to focus on in the university, unless it's Horizon. One of which we don't necessarily focus on these topics as series or as conceptual headers, but mainly in terms of these kinds of references we keep along with us as we go through these various canonical texts. So one good example is, in terms of the specialities of a lot of the people working on the podcast, one of the main ones is the philosophy of the body, the history of medicine, and the philosophy of disability. And this is mostly on the credit to Will on the show, who has incredibly just injected this fundamental lens of a critical philosophy of disability into all his canonical views of the body, critical views of what the value of so-called intelligence, and going through these canonical figures like Hegel or Deleuze and figuring out sort of where the fundamental conceptual limits may be. For me, it's mostly having a criticism of Hegel based on the inherent racialization of his anthropology. And so we try to be sort of in but not of the canon in the same way we try to be in and of the university. Of course, it's not about us, it's about the conceptual tools we put together, and there's going to be a lingering aspect of institutionalization with that, insofar as half of us are institutionalized. I mean that double sense of being PhD students, and there's certain material aspects which allow us to keep doing this for now. But that's just mainly the project of what we try and provide. And we also try to foster some element of a communitarian aspect beyond the podcast, insofar as we give these tools out for communities to use, which has, of course, certain risks. I mean, doing some stuff on accelerationism may give people the wrong idea of what you can do with Deleuze, and there are certain Landian worries about that, which we've tried to combat by doing endless episodes on how Land is wrong. But people, those that don't seem to listen to those ones as much, but that's sort of the outline of what we try and do, and the ends to which we try and put it. I mean, the book is kind of a microcosm of this, really, because the book is called A Philosophy of Escape, and it is essentially a collection of theoretical tools, theoretical weapon. I mean, we can call them weapons in some sense. I mean, Deleuze calls them weapons, and Andrew Colt thinks of these things as weapons, and criticality has a kind of a weapon sort of edge, weapon-like edge to it itself. But this is essentially a token of this project of creating a common tool library of concepts.
Mm. So sorry, it was probably a little bit of a mistake to say that you're a podcast. I am just conflating how I tend to encounter.
Oh no, sorry, I wasn't trying to correct you. I was just
no, but I also wanted to think maybe we could think about how the particular tools we use, and in this sense, media tools, actually can serve to constrain or elaborate certain kinds of thinking together. I mean, I'm thinking here. I'm looking at Chris thinking about a journal like Ephemera, which started 20 some years ago, right? Which I might see as somewhat similar in trying to take certain kinds of discussions around organization theory, but moving them into what was a sort of new idea then, which was let's make everything open access. Now that's not sort of a big deal anymore now, but it was again trying to use a certain set of media tools to move a certain kind of conversations or finding refuge or escape at that time. So thinking about how that maybe enabled certain kinds of things to move around, but then also creates its own format and its own constraints. Well, what you're talking about is a sort of collective practice coming out of like. So, like, I guess you would put it in glib theory, glib way. You might have like the abilities and constraints of a PDF journal versus a Discord server versus a podcast versus a Zoom meeting, and they all have certain kinds of affordances for collective working together.
Yeah, I mean, just on the fundamental limits of podcasting, one of the limits is that it's an audio medium, and therefore transcriptions are. We do some shorter episodes. We do provide transcriptions, but a lot of the transcription services are either really bad in terms of the automation ones, or they are really, really expensive to go back to a back catalogue of a few hundred. I mean, the prohibitions of the medium itself a prohibition. I mean, this is why it's. I mean, Discord servers themselves are not very good for philosophy insofar as you have to keep returning to conversations back and forth. Or at least, no, sorry, that's the wrong way to say it. Not good philosophy. They're not good in the traditional ways philosophy are practiced insofar as following a long-ass conversation. Objections and replies. If you go to something like Descartes' Meditations, because it is such a short form style of messaging. Similar way that philosophy is something like Twitter as well. You can promote philosophy on Twitter by promoting books and ideas through graphics and memes and the like. But it's not a very good place for doing philosophy, given the highly combative nature of the medium, and of course, given that there's a certain character limit. Character limits, and also the way in which every tweet can be exchanged between hundreds of millions of people, well, tens of millions of people maybe. Then that medium privileges and encourages very short categorical statements, which are usually very universal statements, which usually exclude someone and therefore provoke a spiral of discourse about who's not included in these proclamations and the like. So yeah, absolutely.
But I think you could do certain things would work there. I mean, thinking of like Nietzsche's aphorisms, I think would work quite well on Twitter, but not everything else.
Oh, but yeah, Nietzsche's aphorisms. Yeah, they have a very short, biting, diagnostic quality. They're very good at provoking a certain amount. Yeah, they're meant to be provocative. Yeah, absolutely. As Twitter does seem to sharpen a lot of ideas in that space, whereas in a journal, there's any sort of extended disagreement can be held in long form. I mean, it's. I guess it depends how one is using these concepts. Is one sort of going in on a conceptual warpath, or is one trying to do the very sort of almost quietist scholastic view of working through a concept very patiently and sort of trying to come to this more general discursive conclusion?
So I know you were saying that you didn't intend Acid Horizon to serve as a model per se, but I think that actually could be somewhat interesting as a model to think about sort of how you bring together people in a kind of collective refuge or practice to sort of work together on a set of ideas and elaborate them. I mean, maybe it wasn't the intent, but I think that actually could work in different realms, different areas. Or maybe
I mean,
not. I don't know. I mean, to give you a different
mm,
example, at the moment, I'm doing a bit of work and I'm intrigued by this this musical cooperative from Chicago called Catalytic Sound, which sort
mm.
of is mainly sort of improvising and free jazz musicians, and it's about 30 musicians who have banded together to sort of both sort of distribute the music, but also to create a kind of online streaming service. And the idea is it's capped at 30 for various practical reasons. But the idea they have there is not that every musician in the world will sort of or will sort of magically join the cooperative, but rather, okay, this is how we operate. This is how musicians can work together in small clusters. This could be sort of utilized by other people.
I mean, in that sense, yeah. I think when I was sort of disagreeing the idea as to Horizon could be a model, I think I was mainly disagreeing the idea, which I was mostly importing myself, that there was some sort of uniqueness to what we do. Yeah, I agree. In terms of the collective practice of coming together over a shared love of text and also a shared collective of different and usually minoritarian theoretical interests, be it the philosophy of disability, critiques of racial capitalism. In some ways, but a lot of us, I mean, so one of us comes from philosophy of disability background, the other one and then Craig comes from he was teaching in a prison, for example. It is these minoritarian uses of philosophy that are coming together. And I think that is certainly a model, but certainly a method of coming together. I mean, there's a very strong Tikkунist influence in, or Tikkunists or committee can influence not what we do. And it's as simple as some of their concepts are in a book like The Coming Insurrection. I don't mean simple in a derogatory sense. I mean that their sort of imperative in the latter half of that book is, the first one is find each other. The idea is forming communes, and the commune can be any kind of linking that subtracts you from sort of the everyday flows of communication of everyday life and allows a space where one can actually communicate in a different way, or at least not communicate, maybe, but meet. In a way, meet outside of this, have a space of contact where one could have these shared interests and these shared flows of what one is desiring to create in relation to something true about the world and something true about what's wrong about the world. So in that sense, I do think there's I mean, there are examples there. I mean, we're not the only sort of groups doing this. I mean,
Yeah.
For example, I think the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour, our great comrades in arms, have always been very good at this, doing their extended series on mostly in the fields of psychoanalysis. Or there are different mediums for which this interest can be proliferated. I mean, even to some extent on Zero Books we do this. We try to sort of unearth the sort of the sort of latent stuff that's been buried in a lot of Zero Books work, to be honest, because that I mean, yeah, the channel has a bit of a previous history which we're kind of taking on and then trying to go, like being like Walter Benjamin's rag picker, going through all of the weird, slightly slightly neo-populist, somewhat reactionary stuff and finding what was good.
So out of curiosity, I totally get how you go from reading groups and discussion groups to joining together to writing a book, but how did you get from that to making a tarot deck?
So this isn't technically an Acid Horizon thing. This is
okay, sorry, I'm conflating.
No,
Sorry.
No, it's we I think Craig, who produces often the show, is usually hosting it. He does a lot of the. So basically, the reason that tarot deck came about was, essentially, he does a lot of graphic design. He makes a lot of philosophy memes and and he made this one meme once of the Franz of the tarot card. I think it's the Six of Swords or the Five of Swords. So one with all the swords that are on the back of the wall, and the guy's woken up and he's looking at them and look at these swords on his wall and he's horrified. And then Craig redesigned that with the Kafka's Metamorphoses, Gregor Samsa, the giant bug, waking up from his bed and looking horrified. And everyone thought, this is great, you should make a whole deck. He didn't. Then he made another card for a laugh. He made Felix Guattari as the magician. And then people said, well, he can make a full deck. And then he didn't. He eventually got convinced to make the entire major arcana. And then so when we started working for we started writing the book for Repeater. Turns out they're owned by like a mind body spirit publisher, Watkins, and he met one of the guys behind it, a guy called Etan Neilfield, and he sent Craig basically a bunch of like Watkins stuff as like a welcome package or something. And one of it was this tarot deck, all this Jungian style sort of, so he calls it a synchronicity oracle. And then Craig apparently did that, and it says, oh yeah, I should probably do the rest of this deck then. He got interested in it, he pitched it to them, they took it up, and then it was something always adjacent to what we were doing. I mean, I'm not big into esoterica myself. I think it's I quite like that deck because I think it's actually quite a useful teaching tool. Mostly because I think those sorts of implements are very good as what I call intuition pumps. I always treat a tarot deck something like the idea of flipping a coin. So say if you have two things you'd like to do and you're not too sure how to choose between them, you flip a coin, assign one heads, assign one tails. Say you get tails and you feel disappointed, then you know that the other one's more or less what you probably wanted. And I think that the tarot deck, especially from a philosopher's perspective, is quite good because it allows you a set of philosophical and conceptual metaphors to basically provide like readings or predictions or something. Not in the sense that actually come true, but in the sense of, okay, by the way you interpret them, you sort of discover ways that what you want out of the situation, and therefore you can consider whether you could change these conceptual categories or whether you want to change them. And I think that was pretty useful. It's also quite a good party trick, to be honest, to pull out the Philosopher's Tarot deck and read someone as if they're doing like you just describe Thomas Hobbes or something, or I remember once I was at a gathering actually, and was talking about someone's housing disputes. There was going to be evicted by their landlord, and I drew the Mao card, and Mao, of course, the great enemy of all landlords. We had quite an interesting discussion about protracted legal struggles with the landlord after that. So I think they're quite interesting teaching tools. But yeah, it's kind of one of those things that's in, but not all of Acid Horizon, I guess. It's in that milieu.
But I quite like that as a sort of philosophical tool where it's not the idea that you're literally predicting the future at all, but rather as you interpret the things that you pull, the 3 or 5 cards or whatever it is, you discover or learn what you mean, what you're thinking, and how you respond to the situation. So it's almost like
absolutely.
It's almost like a catalyst more than a sort of anything else.
I mean, I always felt like it as well because it's the idea of an old pack of cards is really just an access to a plurality of different kinds of art or different artworks. I mean, a pack of cards is literally a gallery you're carrying around with you. And I think, especially in the tradition, the ways that tarot cards are often used, it was probably some of the most exposure to art a lot of people would have gotten, unless you lived in some of the big cities or if you went to church or something. So it is a way of exploring all these different kinds of sense, different parts of a sensory experience that you could have through the image.
Well, it's interesting because I have a deck of playing cards that were designed by a number of the surrealists, where they changed they changed some of the figures to Hegel and to Artaud, but they're just regular playing cards, so you could just play bridge or rummy or go fish or whatever your preferred game is.
Yes, I think I've seen that one. I think they also did like a tarot as well. And I think Hegel is also the magician, whereas here Hegel's the devil, and apparently that upset quite a lot of people. Actually, for some reason, Craig, who was accused of making a sort of very Catholic critique of the Protestant Hegel, and some sort of if we can call them this, right Hegelians very very upset by that. So that was quite funny.
That's kind of funny. I kind of like. I'm not sure that's quite. Must have been both amusing and kind of interesting and annoying at the same time. But just to say that I'm happy to just keep talking with Adam and throwing things out, but anyone who has things you want to ask or chip in, you are perfectly welcomed and encouraged to say, hey, what about this, or have you thought about this, or what's this other thing? I'll pause for a second to sort of see if anyone wants to. Okay.
So I suppose it's a bit, I'm taking a little bit, jumping back to the refuge comment at the beginning, Adam, if that's all right. I don't want to circle us back to get stuck on a particular point, because it's been interesting, like, you know, the stuff about the sort of the possibilities of unleashing the imaginary around sort of philosophy and sort of supporting almost sort of non-decision making or something with tarot cards. Actually quite interested in that as well. But I am thinking about this, you know, the sort of the struggles that some of us are in. I mean, everybody, I think, I don't know about Paul and Graham, but the rest of us in the room are sort of in the university at some level. And we're having all of these kinds of struggles at the moment that risk exposing, I think, some of those areas of refuge potentially around things like the strikes and the sort of the contestations where it comes out a bit more into the open, and how we sort of intersect with those majoritarian, if you want it that way, politics of kind of labor struggle and things like that, and what that perhaps means for those kinds of little spaces or enclaves that we might kind of carve out, these little sort of heterotopias that we can perhaps create, you know, through these kinds of projects or through other things. I mean, very kind of you to mention ephemera, Stephen. It coincidentally something that I started as a PhD student as well, where I think there are sometimes a little bit more potential spaces, so it's a little easier to sort of find those potential spaces and get people to sort of go along with them, perhaps. Anyway, I don't know, is that intersection around that kind of enclave refuge versus the kind of the more conflictual head-to-head that we're getting into around UCU majoritarian labor politics at the moment, if you've got any thoughts on that, or anybody.
Well,
sorry,
I
a
just say something
focused question.
I mean, regarding like this gradual neoliberalization of university, basically, in my experience, at least in Kingston, it's thinking about the idea of the enclave and the refuge. At least with my experience of how many people, and this wasn't just a fact of the lockdowns, sort of fleeing onto the online spaces to find. I mean, it's weird. It's gone so long that, you know, you even see like sort of peers, you see like entire philosophical like trajectories like accelerate through the internet. So yeah, I wouldn't have seen someone online for a year, and they'll show up to a reading group, and I go, oh, but you know, you was a Takunist last time I saw you. Now you're a sort of a Marxist rationalist Adornian. I think there's a lot of the fleeing from. Yes, it was a lack of space in the university. I mean, I study at Kingston, and they've recently, a couple of years ago now, they built that god-awful new library building, which is fun. It's not really a library. It has this lovely neoliberal design where it's mostly glass, so everything is transparent, constant flows can go in and out. And the top of it, so the library is completely open plan. There's very few places to actually store books. It's mostly computers. There's no booths or secluded spaces or anything. It's completely open, this massive hall. And at the top, there's a reception area and a bar. So naturally, if there's an event for investors or anything like that, or or a talk to promote the university or something, there'll be a stream of people going up and down a staircase, which is in the center, and therefore goes through the study spaces, full of people chatting, getting free wine and champagne and the like. And it's the idea of studying space has become even more enclosed because the university is gradually more of just more of a self-marketing place, an investment for itself. I mean, I don't know if they built UCL's campus in is it Dubai yet, but I don't think they might not even need to bother having a library. And of course, these labor struggles are absolutely tied to the way in which both students and teachers. I remember when it was one of the strikes in 2021. Some of the other students in my I was PhD at the time. This was the MA and MPhil cohort. They were sort of talking about how do we support the strikes, and some of them who were a bit more interested in reenacting May '68 than others decided to, okay, let's occupy some buildings and do teach outs. And I said, look, the problem with the buildings now, they've now become designs. They can lock them electronically. The architecture is actually amplifying these particular minoritarian and majoritarian struggles in the same way. Just it's almost like the micro level of the electronic lock is at the same way the macro level of the actual control of space who owns the teaching space. So I think those other struggles actually absolutely intersect. I mean, there's also have this horrible thing of, I mean, my experience marking and being marked is, of course, I'm very early in any sort of academic integration into the university. So, of course, some of this may actually just be naive or bollocks. But I mean, Turnitin, I think, is a very fascinating machine. The anti-plagiarism machine, we had to feed stuff in. I mean, I had to feed stuff into, at least in undergrad, which has now created the data sets for which automated systems like ChatGPT are getting their resources from. And so I'm imagining a kind of a weird, and I'm not hugely a fan of Zizek, but this kind of Zizekian metaphor where, of course, the student gets ChatGPT to write the essay for them. The instructor, increasingly on the precarious contract, gets turned into mark the grade for them, and then everyone else can use the whatever remaining hospitality the university has on either side to go do some radical study. I mean, those are the encroaching fronts here. I mean, especially when it comes to the ways in which a lot of jobs being reduced to sending emails and the like. I mean, this is why I like the teaching of. I mean, it's not teaching we do in Asset Horizon, I guess. The reading groups, there's an element of some people expect us to know a bit more about the text, but we don't put it forward as, if you've got a question, we'll know the answer to it. It's more like, it's something a little bit like, I guess it's a little bit be like those spaces, for example, in like guitar shops, where occasionally you have like this guitarist come in and say, it's called like a guitar clinic. If you've got a problem with this scale or something, or this sort of fingering, like maybe we'll know how to do it, or someone else will know how to do it there. But what we try to do is to create a space where what people want isn't access to us as like broadcasters, but access to the sort of the collective interest and the collective desire to learn this in the room itself. And I guess I know maybe I'm kind of lucky in terms of some of the teachers I had about teaching, because when I was doing my sort of teacher training, I guess I was mostly learning how to. I'm not going to name the professor, but I'm not going to. I was basically learning about grading, how to subvert the grading system, how to use it to encourage people's actual interest in the things, rather than just because when I first started grading, I thought I had to be really harsh because I was sort of interpolated by the idea that I'm called to do a job. But no, all it called me to do was be a complete arsehole to people who I could instead be talking about how, you got this right, but here's how great this section of Kant is, and here's how bad it is, and let's actually talk about it. It does put that distance, and this distance is really exaggerated by the structure of the university itself to really deny this common interest that the teachers have with students. And I guess this is also because the academia is so bad for studying that, as Moten and Harney put it really well, the interest of many students is determined by debt, which is the value for money we get for how much debt we're put into. There's ultimately a material discrepancy, which is inserted between academic interests and academic what subjects one pursues. And to that extent, I think it's quite interesting insofar as there's this jump, it's almost a sense in which you can see like a horizontal mold forming between students who think, oh, you can actually study what you want to study. I've got to study, I've got to go into banking or something.
The way I think I would respond to that, and I think what you're saying is really interesting, Adam. The way I think you respond to it is I think kind of minor spaces or enclaves have more of a tendency to sort of move around. So thinking about, for instance, like experiences we know, of course, things of like, there was a space at Leicester for a while, and then maybe it moved to Queen Mary, and then maybe it moved somewhere else, or maybe there was a thing that used to be at Sussex that got sort of kicked out and moved to Kingston, right? And so there was a tendency when you have that kind of space I would say not defend it, but to it's easier to move and find another refuge, another escape, than it is to hold on to a space. And that's a certain kind of logic that tends to work more with small minor spaces because of how they operate. And so if we think about them as boroughs, you could have many kinds of boroughs in, the minor is always in part of the major anyways. So it's easier to move them around. But the problem is that you can't always keep escaping. You can't always keep going somewhere else. And that's the moment where you have to sort of find a different logic of operating, where it's almost like you might say the minor space requires and needs some sort of relationship with an overarching structure to continue existing, and can at times enrich or sort of revitalize it, but still remains quasi separate. I mean, this is where I've thought about it, going with Stefan and Fred talking about when they realized that like you could leave the university but without leaving. And so it's meeting that relationship. And I think that's important because oftentimes I also find it a bit strange when you look at, let's say, extra institutional education projects, free schools or projects which try to go outside. Oftentimes they leave, but they bring with them so much sort of ideological framing or even just practical thinking about, we're still calling it a free school. We're still going to treat it like a seminar. Like you're leaving, but in a certain way you haven't left anywhere because you're still doing things quite similar. So you may be formally outside of the institution, but you're still using the similar practices. So that's why I think it's interesting blurring is that you can create a different kind of relationship where you don't leave the institution, but try to bring in other kinds of relationality, bring back in collective studying, even in regards to even without leaving. Yeah. So I guess it kind of blurs. So it's always about how you sort of negotiate or just kind of reworking that kind of linkages or overlaps maybe.
Oh no, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the ways I think what I quite like about what we do in terms of delinking is that the absence of grading, the absence of certification, the absence of giving any over. I mean, I think we talked about this before we started recording. Like, I've increasingly convinced that grades are just passcodes for various different aspects of the labour markets. And coming to an Anti-Horizon reading group sings a show is not gonna. It's not going to. You're not going to put that on your CV at all. Maybe. I mean, there are other ways of doing so-called para-academia that do provide sort of certifications and do provide grading incentives. I mean, this isn't to denigrate his work at all. I mean, there's an academic at the New Centre for Research and Practice who occasionally instructs Colin Drum. He does a lot of interesting stuff on continental sort of philosophy and theory of money, and he has a system where it's called the Mimbra School. It's a Discord server that has various different courses that he teaches, and you have to pay for it, but basically you get the money back if you attend them. And there's that his way of using very sort of monetary incentives, and I think eventually at the end you do actually get some sort of accreditation for it. It's structured in exactly this way, like a kind of teaching. But I do like the idea that one has to keep moving, as Kingston did end up actually moving from Middlesex to Kingston, and that's I think it's quite interesting as well insofar as that constant sort of movement about allows you to tap into it. So, for example, we've had people tap in on reading groups at work. Like they'll have a headphone in, and they'll occasionally they'll give their opinion on this part of the effect, like this part of the nomadic war machine plateau, or people tap in that way. And I think there's a relative use here to having that kind of constancy, at least on the airways as such, because the site can move anytime. I mean, we don't even keep many fixed times for reading groups. We tend to move it attending to the needs of who wants to join. For example, how often we have them is very important. So we used to do some reading groups once every 2 weeks. And then we did it once a month because we thought, okay, there's only so people like their weekends, so we just have one a month, sorry. And then we asked people what people they preferred, and we could notice clearly that the people who preferred the twice a month were the people who had sort of the material background to have more time. They already had either institutional positions or were retired, and they had the more time to just constantly read this kind of stuff. Whereas the people who were kind of like phoning in from work would usually be the ones who were preferring it to be one month on. So it is actually understanding the refuge, where it can be found and where there's a desire for it. It's almost a bit like Narnia in that kind of sense. But I also think the idea of movement is also very good insofar as the movement has to, as he said, have an access to overall structure and overall project. And this is where the idea of fugitivity gets in line with particular sort of the blackness of black study that Moten's talking about in relation to marronage. You know, the idea of if people were in flight, but only insofar as they were willing to escape an actual project that was trying to erase them, not only erase sort of them physically and sort of raise their autonomy as freedom, but also raise the ontologies, the philosophies, the ways in which they connected with the world around them, their epistemologies. And this is why I think like someone like Robinson, he analyzes the obeyer, is so foundational thinking of fugitivity, because they escaped to commune with a source of sort of philosophical nourishment, which allows them eventually to go beyond this refuge and go on the attack. Not asterizing going to go on the attack at any point.
So someone, Paul said something here in the chat. So now we can say, what do you think, chat? And feel like proper Twitch streamers. Okay, do you have any concrete examples of how the neoliberalization of the academy has been halted or jacked somehow? And beyond industrial action, ways of leaving without leaving, doing study in hell. Seems to me that such efforts would rely on energies from students and staff. I guess that's rely on energies from students and staff that the contemporary academy is designed to almost entirely absorb or stifle. I mean, my thought on that would be, I think there is something of that stifling. I mean, going back here to thinking about ephemera, for instance, I remember, you know, like 15, 20 years ago, let's say when I was studying my PhD in 2004, there was very little structure about how we had to complete. It was just like, hey, go do some cool stuff. And we were left to our own devices, as opposed to now PhD students who are now told, like, you must write 10,000 words by month 3. So a lot of times this sort of the freedom to just explore and get lost and do things and work on collective projects that I experienced as a PhD student seems to be increasingly denied by sort of structure and sort of making sure everyone does everything on time. So it does kind of stifle those kind of projects, or can stifle them. So maybe we should go more between examples of things that escape that logic.
It's kind of interesting, isn't it? It's almost like a form and content sort of aspect. So the content of what you're just saying is irrelevant as long as you follow the form and the process and you do everything on time and these things. Then you're the infinitely plastic kind of subject that's still totally employable, right? Just regardless of whether it wants. And I think what we're seeing there, and in Paul's kind of little note in the chat about the neoliberalization of academia, is something I've been thinking about as you've been talking, Adam and Stephen, is we're talking about a tension between two commons, aren't we? And it's this struggle to turn for the undercommons, in a sense, and the borrows, and to create these possibilities for something that's just interesting, yeah, a space for study as a kind of a radical activity, versus this the kind of the commons of capitalism, right? That everything is trying to turn it into, and it is almost like those models that you're just talking about, Stephen. They are perfectly creating that. They are still empty. They are totally devoid of any kind of formal content, and yet they are structured around a particular form that carries its own content, right? In terms of the sort of the ideology that it carries, the modes of subjectivization that it facilitates and enables, and all of those are kind of creating this open commons that actually just produces this infinite resource of indebted students who want to go into banking or whatever, you know, add whichever kind of appalling profession where they're going to learn to hate themselves in this place. But I don't know, sorry, that was a bit of a rambling point of connection, but I do think it's a struggle between two different imaginaries of the commons that we're starting to see. And I see this a lot in my, you know, we're getting a lot of students looking at open innovation ecologies and these kinds of things, or open source innovation networks, but really coming at it in the terms of, right, okay, how can we kind of capture this? How can we kind of create this kind of stuff? How do we get this? And yet constantly then the universities are kind of constantly trying to feed this thing that's constantly trying to capture it. Faster and faster, and we're almost in this sort of accelerating cycle of that. But
what you said there, Chris, is the idea about certain kind of, let's say, a neoliberalization or emptying or stifling that occurs not at the level of ideology or stated goals, but rather we'll just create these pure sensible forms and procedures which are just very sensible and just designed to help facilitate things that have the effect of emptying, but they don't even look like they're emptying because they just seem like they're neutral.
You know, I'm just still hung up with the idea of concrete examples, which is the enemy of any philosopher, I guess. Which is of how the neoliberalization, of the academy has been halted or jacked somehow. I mean, I could probably just present myself as a walking example of how it hasn't been jacked or halted, because I applied to the Arts and Humanities Research Council Technate board with a PhD, which a PhD project is basically said Max Stirner's theory of insurrection, and they didn't see that as a particularly threat whatsoever. They said, actually, no, that's lovely. I mean, the neoliberalization of the academy is kind of hard to jack in any discursive or informational way, because the neoliberalization is kind of just to put it in cybernetic terms, it's it's the automation of the university. It's the elimination of all of the human elements, the noise of actual study and of actual sort of, I mean, the Undercommons is in many ways a very noisy place. He calls it an unsafe neighborhood because it's not purely reducible to these signals. I can write something about Stirner, the coming insurrection, anything like that, and it could be easily commodified. It's the neoliberalization of the academy. Maybe it sort of stands at the limits of speech and writing, insofar as one of the sort of key pillars of academic freedom is one is free to do nothing but speak, as long as this speech is inscribable onto a paper or something could be sold by university press. I mean, hijacking it, I don't. It's very hard to hijack, because it's how do you take down the cybernetic system apart from short-circuiting it? This is something we try to work out in the book, really, and it is about finding places of assembly where you can essentially burn it out. But burning it out doesn't mean maybe the academy isn't stayed. I mean, my sort of worries when we was talking about occupying certain spaces in universities, I basically said, look, the only way to sort of deactivate control over this area would be to somehow do a cyber attack on the IT systems of the entire building, and that's not studying. That's just the sort of stuff that gets you sent to Guantanamo Bay. So it's attacking and deactivating control. I think you have to find new theoretical weapons of doing this without. I mean, maybe this is just me being too cautious and pessimistic, but I am worried about how to combat the cybernetic sort of automation of the academy from inside. I do wonder if it is about just finding this place of refuge and just constantly trying to move around until we clarify what exactly the weak points of neoliberalization are. But again, I'm maybe a bit too pessimistic on this matter.
I'm not sure I want to stick to the hard and fast distinction of content and form, but I think it would have to be how you would intervene or sort of sabotage at that level of form in terms of protocols and relationships, and not like, I've written a very clever think piece for LRB. There, we solved it.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I flip between de Koonist and sort of a Dornian pessimist at these points. I'm not sure.
Paul suggests bring back art school bands, maybe, which reminds me of an example of the story about how the way Leibach started is because they were literally playing using their sort of military uniforms. So maybe we can think of the art school band as literally creating your own war machine, or the philosophy band or assemblage as your own war machine. As
I mean, I really like that idea, actually. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about was one of the ways you can use the neoliberal university against itself, although not in a particularly to flash it out, really, is the idea of occupying a space because all of these places try to present themselves as places of pure communication, the exchange of text, the exchange of ideas, and noise actually is kind of the opposite of signal in a way. Using these big, for example, Kingston University is incredibly well suited for a noise concert, for a Leibach concert. You could totally go in and just play a big speaker for its entirely cavernous hall, which is designed for amplification, and then simply disrupt any of the investors' parties. Not to say it would do Excellent. I actually think the Leibach aspect of noise is something is a line of flight I think someone could follow, or even something like test apartments in the British example.
Mm. Just stick with test part for a second. One of the things I really like about how test evolves as a sort of as a band is they start off as this collection of basically dudes in South London who are going through the wreckage of all this like post-industrial waste and pieces of metal and trash, and they spend hours and hours in their basement in a squat basically banging on pieces of metal, almost like creating like the collective assemblage of how they want to play together by basically just like literally beating metal until they could like actually figure out what they wanted to do. So this is kind of a weird practice.
Just want to see Benjamin's rag picture a little bit, just with the ruins of post-industrial, especially around. I think were they based around Goldsmith's test apartment? I can't remember.
Yeah,
I think
and during the early years, they were part of the assemblage of Goldsmith's people who officially leave the university but never really leave, and they just sort of like hang around and sort of borrow resources and equipment, and which is a long going practice.
Yeah, in terms of I mean, it makes me think as well in terms of leaving in and of the university, also a lot of the early blogosphere. I mean, the early zero book scene. But I don't want to say that I wouldn't say that was a way that neoliberalization of university has been halted or jacked. I think jacked in the sense of hijacking, no, jacked in the sense of diverting resources, absolutely. In the sense of, you get paid, you get given all this money to study X subject, you spend it all on music equipment, or you spend it all on blogosphere equipment. You spend it on a decent computer. There are ways of this. I mean, Mark Fisher was in and out of the university, fundamentally. I mean, the urbanomic folks, I think, very much similar to this. I mean, even to some extent, CCRU did something like this. The problem was that they believed that, I mean, the cyber positivism, I think, wasn't necessarily, I think there was an idea of them trying to hijack the neoliberalization university somewhat, would we say? Well, not the university, but the idea that the positive feedback inherent in the communication technologies at the time was something that was going to create a giant flattening that capital wasn't itself going to see coming, in a sense. The idea of losing one's identity, melting down all of these personal sort of very gendered-based structures if you go into work of Sadie Plant and the like in cyberspace. It's just that didn't quite happen because all the means of cybernation were very much privately owned. I don't know.
Or to give an earlier frustrating example that I like is someone like Silvia Federici, who originally arrives in New York in is it Albany in the early 70s, where she's initially there as a PhD student to write about T.S. Eliot and phenomenology, and she spends the 70s instead organizing the Wages for Housework campaign. So I'm guessing that there was probably some creative reappropriation, because I don't think that was the plan. But it actually worked much better. Yeah. My guess, any sort of jacking or redirection would always be particular and contextual rather than just do this.
Yeah. I think. I say I'm sort of reluctant. So there's a weird history of people who end up doing sort of a leftist sort of philosophy or theory podcast and end up having this sort of inflated idea of themselves. I mean, of the one weird trick theory of revolution. Which is, I mean, the book we're writing is not going to be the Chapo Trap House Guide to Revolution, which is I don't think is really lingered much in theory spaces.
Yeah, Chris unfortunately is being interpolated by another meeting, which is something that it is probably going to affect me in a few seconds as well. But I keep trying to put it off because it's never fun being interpolated by another meeting.
I know the feeling.
But yeah, I definitely think you're right there on the sort of. Maybe I put it in the way that sort of Huey P. Newton puts it, where like he basically says, like, if you in a sort of political process, if you identify any one moment as like, here is the revolution, or here is the thing, you've totally misunderstood it. You need to look at the overall process rather than just particular moments. So any clever leftist podcaster that says, oh, here's the thing. No, it's never the thing. It's always, here's maybe one thing in one place at one time, and in a certain context, it did this.
Yes. We never tried to tell. Oh, sorry.
Oh, and you can learn from and readapt that, but
yeah, we never try to. Not in the sense of, and also we don't try to be prescriptive in this, but we never sort of go and say, okay, here's what has to be done. It's like, it's, I mean, who are we'd rather provide resources in the sense of going up to people and sort of say, okay, how can we help, rather than the sort of transcendental dictation from the central committee of Acid Horizon kind of thing. I think, because we've seen people who end up having, it's just very much a mid 2010s thing of generating a kind of a central personality and essentially creating a de facto party around their podcast base, and it's awful stuff. I mean, insofar as a lot of this maybe insofar as a lot of leftist parties, especially in the Anglosphere, end up being little more than reading groups with very restricted reading lists. We wanted to sort of absolutely throw any of that out the window. Absolutely, we didn't want to. We didn't want to be anything near, like, you know, dare I say their name, like Platypus Affiliated Society and on like that. We wanted to be as far, or sort of you know, the previous era of Zero Books. We wanted to be as far away from that as possible.
maybe it's a bit like, are you familiar with Crass Records?
Were they started by the band at all?
Yeah, but the thing about Crass Records as a record label is what they would tend to do is they wouldn't put out full albums. They would say, okay, we're going to work with the band in terms of recording a single, and like you will learn, and basically, you know, people will learn about how to record things, how to distribute, how to deal with all these things of how they work together, and then they would go off and oftentimes start their own labels, their own projects. So it's almost like here's the toolbox, here's some things you can use, and then get sort of reused or adapted elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, don't Cross put out all of their stems as well, so anyone can remix them. I think I was listening to like Acid Communism FM on Navarra, another very good podcast actually, and which is actually had a very similar. Maybe they do actually do what we do better, but they were talking about how Crass have all their stems out, so anyone can remix them. And I love that as well. It is just a raw toolkit. You know, let 1,000 flowers or / remixes of Punk Is Dead bloom.
Cool. Have you ever heard the country cover of Do They Owe Us a Living?
Yeah.
That's
amazing.
Good. Yeah. Well, anyway, okay. Well, on the 1,000 remixes, 1,000 flowers blooming, maybe we can sort of call that a sort of like a fitting, not ending point, a sort of segue to other things. Well, thank you very much, Adam. I think that was super interesting. Yeah, I've got a lot to think about, and thanks for coming along.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really great. It's been the first time I've actually given a kind of talk like this. If I was a bit rambly, then I apologize in advance. But hopefully this has been helpful. I mean, it's been helpful for me to understand a bit more what we've actually been doing these past 3 years. So
It was quite good.